The morning my life changed, I was carrying a breakfast tray down a hallway so long it seemed to have its own weather system. 42 steps from the kitchen to the East Wing staircase. I had counted them so many times over the past 3 years that my feet knew the number without my mind joining in. The tray held a soft boiled egg in a ceramic cup painted with small blue rabbits, 2 triangles of toast with the crusts cut off, a glass of fresh orange juice at exactly the temperature that was neither cold nor room temperature, but the precise warm cool that she preferred, and a single stem of whatever flower was blooming in the east garden. That morning, it was a pale yellow freesia. I had trimmed the stem to 4 inches so it would not wobble when I walked. I was not supposed to think about what I was doing as anything other than a function. That was housekeeper Bay's word, function. "You are filling a function," she had told me on my first day, handing me a laminated instruction card with the morning routine in 11 numbered steps. "The child has needs. The needs are fixed. You learn the pattern, you execute the pattern, you do not improvise." She had looked at me with the flat appraisal of someone estimating the useful life of a piece of equipment. The last girl improvised. She brought hydrangeas. "The child is allergic." 2 hours in the emergency ward, and the girl was gone before lunch, so I had learned the pattern. 3 years of it. And I had not improvised, except that I did, every morning, in ways housekeeper Bay would never see. I chose the flower with my eyes open, not on rotation. I trimmed the stem. I checked that the blue rabbit cup was always the blue rabbit cup and not the green one, which looked the same to everyone else, but had a slightly rougher glaze on the rim. I kept a running list in the small notebook I carried in my apron pocket, a list of things she noticed and things she didn't, things that had made her still and things that had made her turn away. 3 years of data. 3 years of paying attention to a 9-year-old girl that nearly everyone in the Shin household had decided was, as the politer among them put it, difficult. Her name was Shin Ji-yeon. She was 9 years old and she had been deaf since birth, and she had her mother's eyes, which I knew because there were photographs of her mother everywhere in the East Wing and nowhere else in the house. I knocked on the door with my knuckle in the pattern we had established. 2 quick, 1 slow, 2 quick. Not a code I had invented. It was hers. She had knocked it on my forearm one afternoon 14 months ago, pressing each beat into my skin with 2 fingers, watching my face with the focused attention of someone conducting an experiment. Then, she had looked at me and waited. I had repeated it back on the doorframe. She had studied me for another long moment, then walked away. The next morning, when I knocked using the pattern, she opened the door before I had lifted my hand from the wood. She was standing at the window when I came in, already dressed, watching the garden with the quality of attention she brought to everything. Total, undeflected, slightly unnerving. She was wearing the blue cardigan, not the gray one. That was information. She wore the blue cardigan on days when she was going to agree to something. I set the tray on the small table by the window seat, positioned the freesia at the 10 o'clock corner, and stepped back to the standing spot by the wardrobe that gave her the widest possible clear sightline to the room without me being in her peripheral pressure zone. I had figured out the peripheral pressure zone through a sequence of small failures in the first 4 months. She turned from the window and looked at the tray. She looked at the freesia. Then she looked at me. I signed, "Good morning, Jaeon." My Korean Sign Language was functional. I had spent the first 3 months watching tutorial videos on my phone at 11 at night, sitting on the floor of the staff bathroom because it was the only room in the house where I could be certain of privacy. My vocabulary was now approximately 400 signs. Hers was, as near as I could estimate from watching her communicate with the 2 tutors who came twice a week, and with the 1 therapist who came on Fridays, probably several thousand. She was 9 years old, and significantly smarter than almost every adult in this house, and I had understood that early, which had made the other things easier to understand, why she wouldn't answer questions put to her by people who hadn't learned a single sign, why her face went flat when the visiting relatives spoke slowly and loudly at her, as though deafness were also stupidity, why she tested the maids the way she tested them. She signed back, "You're 4 minutes late." I had been, in fact, 3 minutes and 40 seconds late, because I had re-chopped the egg after the first timing showed a gray ring beginning at the yolk. I signed. The egg needed another attempt. Her expression shifted by approximately 2 millimeters in the direction of less severe. She sat down at the table and began to eat with the precise, unenthusiastic efficiency of someone who viewed breakfast as a logistical necessity. I stood at the wardrobe spot. On days she wanted me to leave, she would make a small pushing motion with her left hand. She hadn't made it. When she had eaten approximately half the egg and 1 triangle of toast, she put her fork down and looked at me with the expression I had learned to read as having decided something. She signed, "The winter party is in 4 days." I knew. The Shin Group annual charity gala, held in the ballroom on the 2nd floor, which would host somewhere between 200 and 230 guests. I had been on the prep rotation for 2 weeks. I signed. Yes. She looked at me for another moment with that experimental result assessment. Then, last year, I sat in the upstairs gallery and watched. This year, I want to be on the floor. I understood what she was not signing, because I had been paying attention for 3 years. Last year, she had sat in the gallery because no one had asked her down, not her father, who had greeted 200 guests with his easy, important handshake, and not once looked up to the gallery where his daughter pressed her forehead against the railing. Not housekeeper Bay, who had positioned Jeon in the gallery the way one positions a decorative object, out of the way but technically present. I signed. "What would you want to do on the floor?" She picked up the freesia by its trimmed stem and turned it slowly between her fingers. Then she set it down and signed something I had to parse twice to be sure I had read correctly. "Dance," she signed. "I want to learn to dance. 4 days is enough if we start today." Of all the things I had imagined she might sign, this had not been among them. I felt something move in my chest that was not quite surprise and not quite grief, something in between. She was 9 years old, and she had never been able to hear a single bar of music in her life, and she wanted to learn to dance before her father's party so she could be on the floor instead of in the gallery above it. I had studied classical Korean dance for 11 years. I had left that life 4 years ago for a set of reasons I kept in the same category as things I did not discuss at work, filed next to the debt that had brought me here and the sister whose university tuition I was paying in installments from my monthly salary. My training was not on my resume. It was not something I had mentioned to anyone in this household. I signed yes. "We start today." The look she gave me then was not gratitude. It was something more considered than gratitude. Something that looked more like, "I had a hypothesis, and it has been confirmed." We began after breakfast in the small parlor off the east wing that nobody used except as a thoroughfare. I pushed the side table against the wall and showed her the first thing, not a step, but a concept. I pressed my palm flat against the floor, then against the wall, then against my own sternum. Vibration, every surface carries it. She watched my hands with that total attention, then pressed her own palm to the floor. Then she looked up at me. I signed. Music is vibration. You can feel the shape of a rhythm through the floor, through a wall, through another person's hand. She considered this for a moment with the focused skepticism of someone who does not accept premises without evidence. Then she pressed both palms flat on the floorboards and waited. I crossed to the built-in shelving unit, which had a Bluetooth speaker on the third shelf that I had noticed 3 months ago and never mentioned to anyone, because housekeeper Bay would have had it removed on the grounds of non-function. I connected my phone and chose something with a simple, deep-bodied beat. The bass moved through the floor. I watched Jayeon's face. Her eyes went very still. It was not the stillness of nothing happening. It was the stillness of a great deal happening, and none of it being wasted on expression. Then she stood up, looked at my feet, and waited. We worked for 2 hours. She learned by watching, and by touch, I would demonstrate a step, then take her hand and walk her through it while she felt the rhythm through the floorboards. She fell twice, mildly, caught herself both times, and did not acknowledge the falls beyond an expression that said this information has been logged and will not recur. By the end of the second hour, she had the basic 3-count turn sequence in her body. Not performance ready, but in her body. When housekeeper Bay came to collect me for the linen inventory, I was back at the wardrobe spot, and the table was against the wall again, and the only evidence was that Jayeon's cardigan had a small floor dust mark on the right knee, which I had already noted and planned to have brushed clean before anyone saw it. The next 3 days, we worked in the same window between breakfast and the first tutor's arrival. I did not think about the other consequence of those hours. Or I tried not to. I tried to categorize it as function, the way housekeeper Bay would. The child has needs, the needs are fixed, you execute the pattern. But at 2 o'clock on the third night, I lay on my narrow staff wing bed and acknowledged what I had been not thinking. That Shin Min-hee, the CEO of Shin Group and the most powerful corporate Omega Alpha in the country, the woman whose press epithet was the Iron Meridian, would be home for the gala. She had been in Singapore for 6 weeks. She would return the morning before the party. She did not know that her daughter's maid had been using the East Parlor for unauthorized dance instruction. She did not, as far as I could determine, know very much about her daughter's daily life at all. I had seen her 3 times in 3 years, each time from a distance. The first time she had arrived in a black car and gone straight to the study, and I had been carrying linens through the second-floor corridor and glimpsed her through the study door. A tall woman in a charcoal coat, standing at the window with her back to the room, speaking to someone on the phone in a voice too low to hear. She had a particular quality of stillness that was different from Jayeon's. Jayeon's stillness was about receiving information. Her mother's looked like the stillness that keeps other things from moving. The second time I had been in the garden, and she had crossed the rear terrace, again on the phone, and I had seen her face in profile. Sharp, considered, a face that had long ago decided which emotions were information and which were weather. She had not looked toward the garden. The third time she had come to the East Wing. It was the last time I had seen it used, 8 months ago, on Jayeon's birthday. I had been waiting outside the parlor with the small cake I had made, the almond one from the recipe I had reverse-engineered after Jayeon had pointed at the photo of it in a magazine, and looked at me for 4 seconds. I heard the conversation through the door, or what passed for a conversation, Shin Min-hee speaking to her daughter in Korean, formal and careful and visibly very earnest. The way someone speaks to a person they want very much to reach and are terrified of getting wrong. Long pauses where Jeon was presumably signing. Then, Shin Min-hee's voice again, lower, something stripped out of it. When the door opened, Jeon came out first with the expression she wore when a hypothesis had yielded a complicated result. Her mother came out behind her. I was standing in the corridor with the cake, and for approximately 3 seconds we made direct eye contact. I had thought afterward that I had probably imagined it, the half moment where her expression had done something involuntary. She was the iron meridian. Her face was not a place where involuntary things happened. She looked at the cake. She looked at Gion. She looked back at me with the same controlled neutrality she would have given anyone holding a cake in a corridor. "Leave it in her room," she said, and walked back toward the staircase. That was 8 months ago. Now she was landing at Gimpo at 9 in the morning, and the gala started at 7 in the evening, and I had 4 more hours with Gion before I would be folded back into the general pre-party preparation machine. We used all 4 of them. At the end of the last session, Gion stood in the center of the parlor and ran through the sequence 3 times without stopping, the 3-count turn. The pause and wait shift I had borrowed from the folk form my teacher had made me practice until it was reflex, the closing position that ended with both hands extended, palms up, which I had originally shown her as the pose from the form, but which she had adopted with an instinctive understanding of what it communicated. Here I am. I am not hiding. When she finished the 3rd run, she looked at me. I signed, "You're ready." She signed, "I know." I brushed the floor dust off her cardigan and took the breakfast tray back to the kitchen. I did not think about Shin Min-hee landing at Gimpo. I thought about the linen pressing that needed to be done by 4, and the floral arrangements that needed to be moved from the cold room to the ballroom by 5:30, and the 67 other things on the pre-party task list with my name beside them. The scent hit me in the 2nd floor corridor at 11:43. I knew it was irrational to describe it to myself. I had never met the woman at close range. But I was an Omega, and I was 26 years old, and I had been on suppressants since I was 17, the low-dose formulation that dampened heat and dampened the sharper frequencies of scent reading but did not eliminate the fundamental machinery. And the fundamental machinery said, alpha. Here, specific, the way a key is specific to a particular lock without the lock being able to explain how it knows. Sandalwood, and something colder under it, clean cold, the way certain stone rooms smell, mineral and held, neither aggressive nor sweet. Very still. I turned to find her standing 6 feet away. Shin Min-hee was 41 years old. She was wearing a slate blue wool coat that had not yet been exchanged for indoor clothes, which meant she had come directly upstairs rather than to the study, and her carry-on bag was still over one shoulder, which meant she had also bypassed the household staff receiving station in the entry hall, which housekeeper Bay would have opinions about. She was 3 inches taller than me. She was looking at me with an expression that a journalist would describe as unreadable, and that I, who had spent 3 years learning to read expressions that other people dismissed as blank, read as surprised. Specifically, not expecting this person here and recalibrating. "You're the East Wing maid," she said. Not a question. Yes, I shifted the stack of pressed tablecloths to my left arm. "I was told you were arriving at 9. I was. She looked at me for another moment. I came through the service entrance. The service entrance opened directly to the 2nd floor corridor. That explained the scent arriving without the usual advance warning of the main entry sequence. It did not explain why she had come through the service entrance when she owned the main one. "Welcome back," I said, because something was required. She looked at me for 2 more seconds with that quality of attention that felt like something being weighed. Then she said, "How is Gion?" It was not structured as a question. It was structured as a request for a report from someone who expected accurate information rather than reassurance. I said, "She's well. Her French tutor says her reading comprehension improved significantly in October. She's been sleeping through the night consistently since we adjusted the blackout curtains to the north-facing set instead of the south-facing ones. She has been engaged and in good spirits for the past week. Shin Min-hee looked at me with a new quality in the look. She was recalibrating again. She rarely sleeps through the night, she said. She does now. Another pause. The sandalwood and mineral cold did not make it easier to maintain a professional register, and I noted that fact with the part of my mind I kept for noting things I would deal with later. Are you going down to see her before the event briefing? I asked. Yes, she's in the east parlor. Don't knock. Too quick, one slow. Too quick. Something happened to her expression. Very small, the kind of shift that requires years of practice to produce or to read. She said, "She gave you a knock pattern." 14 months ago. She looked at the tablecloths in my arms, then at my face again. The look had changed character a third time, and I did not immediately have a name for the new one. She said nothing else. She walked past me toward the east wing. She was perhaps 8 feet away when she said, without turning, "What's your name?" "Ha Soyeon," I said. She walked on. The party started at 7. By 6:45, I had changed into the formal staff uniform and was stationed in the ballroom antechamber, which was my post for the first hour of any event, tray management and flow direction. The room was filling with the particular breed of person who comes to charity galas, important dressed, self-contained, practiced at making social collision look effortless. I moved between them with the institutional invisibility that 3 years of household staff work had thoroughly installed in me, the way good furniture is invisible. Nobody looked at me except to take something from or place something on my tray. At 7:28, Shin Min-hee entered the ballroom from the south door in a midnight-colored dress that had been cut with the kind of structural seriousness that said, "This is not decoration." The room reacted. It was not a loud reaction. It was the quieter, more complete reaction of people who are very practiced at not reacting to important people and are failing anyway. I had been watching the dynamics of rooms for 6 years, waiting tables through university, assisting at the documentation firm, then this, and I read the reaction in approximately 2 seconds. Total. She moved through the room with the Iron Meridian's particular technique of social navigation, which was not the usual elite technique of seeking and greeting, but its inverse. She allowed people to approach her. She was not cold. She was not unkind. She was somewhere more precise than those options. She was present without opening, and people felt the distinction and orbited accordingly. I tracked her in my peripheral vision the way I tracked all the significant variables in any room I managed. It was function. Tray angles, flow patterns, the couple near the east pillar who were about to back into a waiter. Function. At 7:49, a woman arrived late in a dress the color of a bruise, with a kind of entrance timing that is never accidental. I had seen photographs of Counselor Yoon Sarah in the household's social event files. She was 43, a former business associate of the Shin Group, a woman who moved with the coiled precision of someone who has spent decades being underestimated on purpose. She was also, according to the social files and the overheard conversation fragments that accumulate in 3 years of being invisible, the reason Shin Ji-yeon's mother had never remarried, not because Shin Min-hee still loved her, but because Counselor Yoon had ensured, through a sequence of well-timed public statements about grief and loyalty, that any new relationship would be read as a betrayal of the dead and therefore of the empire that eulogized her. She was the kind of person who understood exactly how a room's attention could be used as a weapon, and she went immediately to Shin Min-hee's orbit, smooth and certain, and I watched Shin Min-hee's face do something almost invisible in response, Not warmth, not hostility, something much more controlled, and therefore more interesting. Management. I did not think about this. I managed my tray. At 8:15, I took a brief back corridor break, and when I came back to the ballroom, the live string quartet in the south alcove had shifted from the ambient underscoring to something with a clear waltz architecture, 3-count and deliberate, and I felt rather than saw the vibration change in the floor under my feet and understood before I looked. Jeon was on the ballroom floor. She was standing at the edge of the open dancing area, in the dark green dress that had been hanging in her wardrobe for 3 weeks and that I had quietly had pressed on Tuesday. She was standing with the particular still point posture she used when she was about to commit to something, both palms pressed very lightly against the sides of her thighs, feeling the vibration through the floor. Nobody was looking at her. That is not precisely accurate. Several people had clocked her presence with the calibrated glance of people deciding whether this element required any social action on their part, concluded no, and returned to their conversations. One of the Shin Group deputy directors, who had been greeting guests near the east pillar, made eye contact with a colleague and produced the small, controlled expression of someone who has decided not to intervene in something that is likely to be briefly awkward. I knew that expression. I had watched it used on Ji-yeon her entire life in this house. I set my tray on the nearest station. There was a calculation involved that I made in approximately 1 second, because it was a calculation I had been running for 4 days without naming it as such. My position in this household, the permission structure of a staff event, the thing housekeeper Bae would say, the face Shin Min-hee would make. The weight on the other side of the calculation, Joyeon standing at the edge of the floor, with her palms against her thighs, 9 years old, having worked for 4 days to be here and not in the gallery. I crossed the floor. I stopped in front of her. I waited until she looked up. Then I signed, very clearly, in the clean sight line she needed, "Dance with me. Please." Something happened to her face. It was not surprise. It was something I had seen only 3 times in 3 years, relief in a child who has been too young to know she was waiting for something and too old to show it when it arrived. She gave me her hand. I led her to the center of the floor, and we began. The quartet was playing something built on a clear 3-count spine, and Joyeon had the rhythm through the floor and through my hand, and through the 3 years of my knowing exactly how she received information, and she moved through the sequence we had built in the East Parlor with the precision of someone executing a plan they've been developing in secret. I was watching her face. I was not watching the room. I didn't need to, because I could feel the quality of the room's attention changing around us, the way a barometric shift changes the weight of air, the conversations going quieter, the peripheral glances becoming direct attention, the particular silence of 220 people deciding something. Jeon did not notice. Or she noticed the way she noticed everything, total, filed, continuing the current task. She executed the 3-count turn. She held the weight shift. She came into the closing position with both hands extended, palms up, and looked at me. I signed good. She signed back, I know. And then someone was there. I felt the scent before I processed the presence, sandalwood and mineral cold, very close, and under it something that had changed in the past 30 seconds, something warmer breaking through the controlled still surface register. I looked up. Shin Min-hee was standing at the edge of the small, clear space that had opened around us on the floor. She was looking at her daughter. The expression on her face was not the Iron Meridian's expression. It was the expression I had glimpsed fragments of through a parlor door 8 months ago, in the pauses between the careful, formal sentences, the face of someone trying to reach across a distance they don't entirely know how to measure, and being given, without asking for it, a key. Jiyeon saw her mother. She went very still, with a kind of stillness different from all her usual stillnesses. Not the stillness of receiving information, not the stillness of managing the room. A 9-year-old stillness of, "You came." Shin Min-hee looked at me. I stepped back, and she stepped forward and held her hand out to her daughter, with an expression I had no professional category for, and did not try to manufacture one. Joyeon looked at her mother's hand. Then she put her own into it. I returned to my tray station. I watched the floor from the corner of my eye, which was function, monitoring, the same peripheral attention I brought to all the significant variables. The fact that my hands were not entirely steady while I reloaded the tray was information I filed and did not report. The deputy director who had made the controlled discomfort expression at the east pillar was now watching the floor with an expression of a fundamentally different variety. The woman beside him, a senior managing partner whose name I knew from the social files, said something quietly that I was too far away to hear, and he nodded. I understood what was being communicated. A recalibration was occurring in real time across the room, and the center of it was a 9-year-old girl in a green dress who had spent 4 days practicing how to be present. Counselor Yoon Sarah was also watching. Her expression was the most controlled thing in the room, which meant it was the most revealing thing in the room. At 8:42, the quartet shifted keys, and Shin Min-hee guided her daughter through what the room could now see was a partnership of improvisation, the CEO of Shin Group, the Iron Meridian, following her deaf 9-year-old's rhythm rather than the reverse. I managed my tray. I did not think about the sandalwood and mineral scent that had come very close and then receded. I thought about the lemon tartlets that needed to be deployed from the kitchen at 9 o'clock. The event debriefing happened at 11:45 in the morning, 2 days later. I was not scheduled to attend. It was a director-level review. I was in the East Wing replacing the fresh freesia, which had dropped a petal overnight. Housekeeper Bae appeared in the doorway at 11:53 with an expression I had never seen her produce. "You're wanted in the study," she said. The study was on the first floor. I had been in it twice, once to deliver documents and once during my initial household orientation. It smelled of the particular kind of order that is maintained by people who are never themselves in disorder, and it had 3 long windows facing the rear garden and a desk that suggested the person who worked at it did not believe in the concept of an empty surface. Shin Min-hee was standing at the window, not the desk. The window. The posture was the same one I had seen in the photograph from 3 years ago. Back to the room. Stillness, the specific quality of someone who turns their back on rooms because they have something to do with their face that isn't ready yet. She turned when I came in. "Close the door," she said. I closed it. "Sit down." There was a chair in front of the desk. I sat in it. She remained standing by the window, which meant she was looking down at me. But the effect was not the one it would have been with most people in her position. It was not designed to subordinate. It was designed, I thought, to give her some distance to conduct herself across. She said, "My daughter has been sleeping through the night for 3 months. Yes, because of the curtains. Partly the curtains, the light-off time, the water temperature before bed. Housekeeper Bae's logs have no record of any of these changes. No, because you didn't ask permission." I said, "I asked Jaehyun." The expression that crossed her face at that was extremely brief, and I read it as something striking something internal. She said, "She gave you the knock pattern 14 months ago. She doesn't give anyone the knock pattern. Her therapist has been working toward that for 2 years. I didn't say anything. I waited. "She's been learning to dance," Shin Min-hee said. "Yes, for how long? 4 days before the gala." Who taught her? There was no utility in deflecting this. I did. She looked at me for a sustained period that I did not try to fill. The quality of the look had shifted away from the official interrogation register toward the one I did not have a clean professional category for. She said, "Your resume listed previous employment at a documentation and translation firm. Before that, administrative support. Before that, university. It did not mention dance training. It wasn't relevant to the role. 11 years of classical training is not relevant to the role." She had done research. I noted the data point and kept my breathing professional. "I wasn't hired to teach dance." "No," she said. "You were hired to execute a pattern." She said it without the inflection housekeeper Bay used, not a correction, not quite an echo. Something more like, "I know the words, and I want you to know I know them. Why did you teach her?" I said, "She asked me." She can ask anyone. She never asks anyone. She asked me because she knew I would say yes. How did she know that? Because she's been paying attention for 3 years, I said. She pays attention to everything. That's not the same as being difficult. Shin Min-hee went quiet. Not the room going quiet, her. A specific stillness that was different from the window stillness. Something that was less about management and more about a particular kind of exposure. She turned back to the window for 3 seconds. Then she turned back. She said, "I'm restructuring her care arrangement. Housekeeper Bay will retain general household oversight. I want a dedicated role, personal aid specifically to Jeon, reporting directly to me." She paused. "The salary is 3 times your current position." I thought about my sister's tuition installments. I thought about the debt. I thought about the East Parlor and the tablecloths and 42 steps and 14 months of a knock pattern and a child in a green dress with her palms extended. "What does the role require?" I said. "What you're already doing, plus accompanying her to external appointments and events, coordinating with her therapist and tutors, and reporting to me directly every week." She stopped. Then, in a different register, lower and more carefully placed, "I'm in Singapore more than I'm here. I need to know what's happening with her from someone who is actually looking." The silence after that had a different texture. It was the texture of something being admitted that is not ordinarily admitted. "I'll take the role," I said. She nodded. Not the dismissal nod, something else. She said, "The knock pattern. Too quick, one slow, too quick." "Yes, she showed you?" She pressed it on my forearm. Shin Min-hee looked at me for one more long moment. The sandalwood and mineral cold had a different note in it now, very faint, something that had shifted under the controlled surface register toward the warmer end of its range. She looked away first. "Housekeeper Bay will have the paperwork ready by Friday," she said. I stood. I said, "She's going to want to show you the rest of what she learned. She only did the first part of the sequence at the gala. There are 3 more parts." The expression on Shin Min-hee's face was the one from the corridor, the one I did not have a professional category for. She said, "Tell me when she's ready to show me." I went back to the East Wing. I replaced the freesia. I stood at the window spot and looked at the rear garden while Joyeon ate her egg. She did not ask about the study. She ate methodically and then looked at me and signed. "The curtain on the left is 3 centimeters lower than the right. It's been 3 days. I took the left curtain down and rehung it." She watched me with the experimental result expression and then signed, "My mother asked me this morning if I would show her my dancing. I got the stepladder from the hall closet and did not let my face do anything." I signed, "What did you say?" She signed, "I said she has to learn the knock pattern first." I hung the curtain. I checked the height against the right one. I got down from the ladder and looked at Jeon, who was watching me with 9 years of total, undeflected attention and a faint upturn at the corner of her mouth that she allowed herself approximately once per week. I signed, "That sounds right." The months that followed had a different architecture than the 3 years before them. Not easier, different. The role restructuring put me in the formal weekly reporting chain to Shin Min-hee, which meant a video call every Wednesday evening when she was in Singapore and a direct meeting on Thursdays when she was home. I wrote the reports the way I wrote everything, exactly, with counted specifics, without softening for palatability. She read them the same way. She began adding questions in the margin of the written summaries she requested in addition to the calls. Questions in the compressed handwriting of someone who is always working against a time constraint. What made her willing to go to the appointment alone this time? What is the book she carries but never reads? What did she mean by the wrong kind of quiet? I answered them. All of them. The book she carried but never read was her mother's, a collection of poems by someone I had to look up, a poet who had been important to Shin Min-hee's mother before she died, and Jion had taken it from the shelf in the study without asking and never opened it, and had been carrying it for 6 months. The wrong kind of quiet was the quiet that happened when adults were present but not actually there. A distinction Jion had arrived at on her own and could describe with precision and sign. A distinction that required, I noted in my response, someone who had been very carefully paying attention to the difference. Shin Min-hee's reply to that particular report came 4 hours after I sent it, which was very fast for a woman with her schedule. It said, "She told me about Ha So-yeon before she told me your name. She called you the one who counts." I did not know what to do with that for approximately 6 hours, and then I did the thing I generally did with information that required time to properly file. I went back to work. She was home more. Not by a dramatic reorganization. She was still the head of an enterprise that operated across 7 countries, and the logistics of that did not restructure for personal reasons, but by the kind of incremental choice that is more meaningful than the dramatic kind because it costs more in the currency of time rather than gesture. 3 days became 4. She came back from Singapore 2 days early in March, and in May she moved a board meeting from Seoul to the study at home. I did not comment on this because it was not my information to comment on. I watched Jion watch her mother settle into the East Wing study for a full day of calls, watched Jion position herself on the window seat of the adjacent room with her book and her careful peripheral attention, and I went and handled the rest of my work. The dancing lesson happened on a Saturday in April. Jion had decided, and she communicated the decision to me on Thursday morning as a logistical statement rather than a request. Saturday, the East Parlor, 10 o'clock. Both of you. I told Shin Min-hee in that week's Thursday meeting. Something crossed her face, the specific one, the vulnerable one, the non-iron meridian one, and then she said, "I don't know how to. I haven't danced since before Jion was born." "That's fine," I said. "You're not the student. She's going to teach you the sequence she learned. Your job is to learn it." A pause. "From you?" From her. She looked at me with a quality of attention that was distinct from the attention she brought to the reports. It was less analytical and had something more exposed at the bottom of it. She said, "You'll be there." It was not a question, but I answered it. Yes, Saturday morning the East Parlor had its table pushed against the wall and its Bluetooth speaker on the 3rd shelf, and Joyeon arrived at 9:57 in the blue cardigan, which was information. Shin Min-hee arrived at exactly 10, which told me she had been ready earlier and had waited. She was not in the coat. She was in a dark charcoal sweater that looked like something worn for a task rather than a presentation, and her hair was not the gala hair. She looked like herself at one frequency lower than the public one, and the scent that entered with her was the same sandalwood and mineral cold, but with the warmer undertone that had been present since the curtain morning. Jiyeon looked at her mother for 3 seconds with her experimental result expression. Then she signed something in the direction of me to translate. I said, she says, you have to learn the knock pattern before I teach you anything else. Shin Min-hee looked at her daughter with the expression I had by now accumulated enough data to name properly: love in someone who has been systematically afraid that love is insufficient currency for what the situation requires. She held out her left forearm. Jiyeon pressed it in. Too quick, one slow, too quick. Shin Min-hee repeated it on the doorframe. Jiyeon watched her. Then she signed, again. She did it again. Again, she did it again. Then Jiyeon gave a very small nod and pressed play on my phone, which she had taken from the shelf with the confidence of someone who had decided this was now her equipment to operate, and the bass moved through the floorboards, and she turned to her mother and held out both hands, palms up, in the closing position from the end of the sequence, the one that said, "Here I am not hiding," and reversed it into an opening. "Here, take this, begin here." Shin Min-hee took her daughter's hands. I stood at the wall and ran the music and watched a woman who ran an empire follow her 9-year-old daughter's count through a sequence of steps she had never been taught, making every mistake and being corrected without mercy, and repeating the corrections with a total patient attention that was its own kind of recognition, the same recognition Jiyeon had first tested in me. The willingness to be a student, to receive instruction from the person in the room who actually has the knowledge regardless of every other hierarchy. By the end of the second hour, Shin Min-hee had the sequence, not performance ready, in her body. Jiyeon looked at her and signed, "Good." Shin Min-hee looked at me. I translated. She looked back at her daughter. "What does she want me to say back?" I said, "The correct response is, I know." The expression on Shin Min-hee's face at that was the kind of thing I was going to have a great deal of difficulty filing under any professional category, ever. She looked at Jiyeon and said, "With perfect gravity, I know." Jiyeon's expression stayed controlled for approximately 2 seconds. Then she did a thing she almost never did, which was to produce an expression that was not information management, and not experimental assessment, and not strategic calibration. She produced a smile that was simply a smile. The involuntary kind, a 9-year-old smile, and she went and sat down on the floor against the wall and picked up her book and began to read, which was how she indicated that a significant event had been concluded satisfactorily, and we could all proceed. Shin Min-hee stood in the center of the east parlor with her hands at her sides and looked at her daughter reading on the floor, and I watched her hold very carefully the face she needed to hold, and then she said, without looking at me, "Soyeon." "Yes, the weekly meeting. This Thursday." "Yes, I'm going to ask you something at the weekly meeting." I looked at the floor. The bass had gone quiet. Jiyeon had turned the music off when she sat down. I could still feel the shape of the last beat somewhere behind my sternum. "All right," I said. She picked up her coat from the chair back and left the parlor. I did not follow. I stood with the speaker on the shelf and Jiyeon reading on the floor, and the freesia and clean wood smell of the east wing around me, and I sorted through what I could sort and left the rest in the pending category for the time being. Jiyeon looked up from her book and signed, without preamble, "She smells different when she talks to you." I said nothing, because there was nothing professional to say to that. Jiyeon looked at me for another 2 seconds, then looked back at her book with the expression of someone whose hypothesis had again been confirmed. The Thursday meeting was in person. She was home. We met in the study, the same room as before, the 3-window room, with the desk that was never empty. I sat in the chair in front of the desk. She sat on the edge of the desk, which was different from all the previous meetings, and I cataloged the difference without identifying what it meant while I could still keep my face professional. She said, "I want to change the reporting structure." I said, "To what?" She said, "I want you to stop reporting to me as staff." The silence lasted 4 seconds. I was counting. What would I report as instead? "I want you to come to Singapore with us in September," she said. Jeon and me. I'm restructuring the schedule to reduce my travel, but September is unavoidable, and I want her with me for once. And I want you there because she trusts you, and because she stopped. The stopping was not a loss of words. It was a controlled decision to change the frame, and I watched her make it, and she started again. "I would like to understand what it means that my daughter calls you the one who counts, and I find myself wanting to know what you notice, not just what you observe." The distinction between noticing and observing was the kind of distinction a person arrives at after a considerable amount of time thinking about attention and what it costs. I said, "Those are different things." "I know they're different things," she said. "You know both of them." There was a version of this moment where I said something about the position structure and the professional boundaries and the clear conflict of interest inherent in the existing hierarchy. I had that version ready, because I had been a diligent person in difficult situations for long enough to always prepare the professional version. I said, "The knock pattern is too quick, one slow, too quick." She looked at me for a very long moment. The sandalwood and mineral cold had moved again, warmer, not sweet. It was not a sweet scent. It did not become sweet, but with more of the undertone that had been accumulating since April. Her scent gland, at the base of her throat, was not something I was looking at directly, and I noted that fact too. She said, "You're going to make me press it on your arm." Yes, she held out her hand. I extended my forearm. She pressed it, too quick, one slow, too quick, not testing. Knowing, I repeated it on the edge of the desk and did not look away. She said, "Again." I did it again. She said, very quietly, "What do you notice about me?" This was the question under all the other questions, the one that had been there since the second-floor corridor, and I was going to answer it honestly or not at all, that you came through the service entrance because you needed to see the house before the house could prepare to be seen, that you moved the board meeting here in May because you wanted to be home and needed a professional reason, that you learned the knock pattern in 4 repetitions and got it right each time and knew you got it right, that you asked me what my name was and then used the reports to find out what I was before I had it. I stopped, that you smell different in this room than you do in any other part of the house. She was very still. How do I smell in this room? Less managed, I said. The silence was a specific kind, the kind that has weight and requires something to be set down into it or it will collapse. She looked at me with an expression I did not yet have a name for, because it was new, the first one I had seen her produce that was not a variant of anything I had categorized. That was its own thing entirely, something that had no management in it at all, and for a person of her discipline and architecture, that was a very specific and complete kind of exposure. She said, "The feeling has been present for a long time." I said, "I know, since the corridor." "Since the corridor. You're going to make this." She stopped again. Not the controlled stop this time. The kind of stop that happens when the thing you meant to say and the thing that's true have diverged. She started over. "I don't know how to do this without being sure it isn't, without being certain it's a choice and not." She put her hand out toward her collar and then stopped that too, and I understood. She was managing the instinct response, the alpha command and claim instinct that had been building since the second-floor corridor, managing it the way she managed every room she walked into, by sheer force of architecture. The thing I had been told about alphas like her by everyone who had ever described alphas like her, the power, the claim reflex. The instinct to take what they wanted was not the thing I was watching. I was watching someone hold themselves precisely at the line because they needed to know which side of it was a choice. "Tell me to stop," she said. Very low, very controlled. "Tell me to stop, and I will." I had been carrying 11 years of classical dance in my body without mentioning it to a single person in this household, had been carrying a 400-word vocabulary of someone else's language into a 9-year-old's mornings, had been carrying a notebook of observations that I never showed anyone because no one had ever thought to ask. I had been carrying the feeling since the corridor too, and the thing about carrying is that it requires you to know what you're holding. I said, "Don't stop. The claiming mark is not what the novels say it is, or rather, the novels get the mechanics right and miss the content entirely. It is not possession. It is recognition. It is the specific act of saying, this one, this person, I will remember in my body, and when the world is very large and very loud and very demanding, I will know which direction home is." I knew that before. I knew it more completely after. There is a morning that becomes the center of gravity for what came later, not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary in a way that our lives had not previously managed to be, and ordinary was what both of us had been working toward, without calling it that. Shin Min-hee was at the desk by 7, she was always at the desk by 7, and Jaeon was eating her egg at the parlor table, and I was standing at the window spot, and the East Garden was showing the first signs of whatever September decides to do with itself, and Jaeon put down her fork and looked at me and signed something. I said. She says, "You're both here." Shin Min-hee looked up from the desk. Jaeon signed again. I translated, she says, this is the right kind of quiet. She had not signed it at me or at her mother. She had signed it at the room. At the specific quality of air in the East Wing, when the right people were present and paying attention. She had a vocabulary for it now, the distinction she had been working on for years, wrong quiet versus right quiet. The quiet that costs more than shouting versus the quiet that is simply the absence of hiding. The breakfast tray had a new flower that morning, not freesia, a small sprig of white wisteria that I had found in the North Garden section I didn't usually cover. I had trimmed the stem to 4 inches. Joyn had looked at it for a moment before she ate. She hadn't signed anything about it. She picked it up by the stem and held it carefully through the whole breakfast, and when she was finished eating, she walked across to the desk and set it in the small glass her mother kept her pens in, which had enough water left in the bottom to serve. She signed at her mother. "Don't forget it's there." "I won't forget." Joyon signed. "You said that about the mint plant in October. That was different," Shin Min-hee said. "The mint plant didn't have someone checking on it." Joan looked at me. I signed, "She's right, I'll check." Joan made the satisfied nod of someone whose operational infrastructure is functioning as designed, and went back to her egg. What happened to Counselor Yoon Sarah in November was not my doing and not primarily Shin Min-hee's doing in the direct sense, though the consequences that followed were in part administered through Shin Group's legal team, who worked with the precision and thoroughness of people who understand that a job worth doing is worth doing completely. The documentation that surfaced the counselor's decade of supply chain interference and misappropriation had been assembled by Jeon's Friday therapist, who turned out to be a forensic accountant who had been building a secondary case for the Financial Crimes Division for 2.5 years. The therapy had been real. The accounting had been real. They had not been mutually exclusive. The counselor's management of Shin Min-hee's public image, the grief and loyalty architecture that had made any relationship read as betrayal, came undone 3 days after the financial case broke, in the way that structures designed from the outside always come undone when the inside shifts, all at once and not dramatically, just completely. The press conference was straightforward, handled by someone who was very good at press conferences, and the statement clarified what needed to be clarified with neither more nor less information than the situation required. The 100 or so people who had been navigating their relationships with Shin Group around the counselor's influence recalibrated in the way that people recalibrate when a significant variable is removed from the equation. I was present for none of that. I was in the East Parlor with Jion, who had been following the news through the crawl on the household's common area screen and processing it with the focused efficiency she brought to any dataset that changed the parameters of her world. She was not upset. She was working through the implications, logging them, categorizing. She signed at one point she was taking up space that didn't belong to her. I signed yes. She signed now it's gone. I signed yes. She thought for another moment and then signed, was my mother sad about it? The question carried the specific weight of a child who has been watching her parent carry something for years and has known, without having language for it, that the carrying was costing something. I said, I think she's more tired than sad, the way you feel after you've been holding something heavy for a long time and you put it down. Jion absorbed this. Then, will she sleep better? I said, I think so. She signed, tell her to drink the tea before bed, the kind that's not the bitter one. I said, you can tell her. She gave me the experimental result look. Then she picked up her book. Singapore was Jion's first time out of the country. She approached it the way she approached new environments, by collecting data at a pace that looked like stillness, but was not. Her palms occasionally pressed to surfaces to feel what they were doing. Her notebook she had started keeping one, small and blue, which she had selected herself without comment, always near her right hand. She was extraordinary with airports. She watched the flow patterns and the queue logic and the signage hierarchy with the attention of someone compiling a system, and by the time we landed, she had a working mental map of Changi that was probably more accurate than the one in the airport's app. Shin Minhee watched her daughter navigate the airport from 3 feet back, with the expression I had seen her produce since April, the one that had no management in it, complete, exposed, and in the specific way that Jion was extraordinary at seeing, completely seen. She looked at me once during the transit not to say anything. Just to confirm, yes, I see this too. I confirmed it. We stayed for 9 days. The business was business, meetings, a regulatory review, a dinner with 3 people who had the careful manner of people accustomed to being very precisely paid attention to. Jion came to 2 of the dinners and sat through them with the posture and exact social calibration of someone significantly older than 9. And afterward, in the hotel corridor she signed at me, the one on the left is lying about the Singapore figures, but he doesn't know she knows. I said, she probably does know. Joyeon signed, good. I left her a note. I looked at her. She looked back at me with the 9-year-old's version of the Iron Meridian's expression, which was slightly more alarming than the adult original because it had no 40 years of convention softening it. I said, what did the note say? She signed, 3rd column, April, the number is transposed. I thought about this for a moment. I said, you should probably tell her yourself next time. Jion considered this. Then, will she listen? I said, she listened to me. Jion absorbed this, filed it, moved on to the hotel breakfast question, with the efficiency of a person who sees no reason to stay on a solved variable, We came back in October with a better understanding of several things, including the nature of the recalibration that had been occurring in the Shin household for the better part of a year, and what it required to be formalized. The proposal was not what I expected, and I expected fairly little, because I had learned by now that the things Shin Min-hee did that mattered to her were not conducted in the register that the people who wrote about the Iron Meridian would expect. She was not a grand gesture person in the public sense. She was a grand gesture person in the very specific sense of, she would move a board meeting to be home for a Saturday dance lesson. She would learn a knock pattern in 4 repetitions and get it right each time. She would put down 40 years of controlled distance because a 9-year-old's maid had said she paid attention and turned out to mean it. She came to the East Wing on a Tuesday morning, which was not a meeting day and not a Thursday, and not any scheduled inflection point. Joyeon was at her tutor session. I was repressing the curtain on the left side, which had dropped 2 millimeters again. I heard the knock before I processed it. Too quick. One slow, too quick. I opened the door. She was holding a small box, not a large one, the kind of box that has exactly one thing in it and knows it. She was in the charcoal sweater, and her hair was not the public hair, and her scent was the unmanaged version, the mineral cold and sandalwood, with the warmer undertone running all the way through it now, without the surface management. She said, "I have a question." All right. She held out the box. It was my mother's. The setting is old. I've had it cleaned. I looked at the box. "I am asking," she said carefully, in the register of someone who has thought about every word, with your words, not with anything else, with only words. I said, "What are you asking?" "To count exits together," she said, "to be the right kind of quiet." A pause. "To give you the knock pattern." A longer pause, and her voice had changed, the way her scent had changed, the armor off entirely, to be the person you notice when I stop managing and to be worth what you see. The box had a ring in it. The setting was old, her mother's, she'd said, a sapphire in a plain band that looked like it had been worn in a working life rather than a ceremonial one. I said, "Yes." She put it on my hand. She held my hand for a moment and did not say anything, because she was a person who knew what required language and what required silence, and I was a person who had spent 3 years learning to read the difference. The morning light came through the east wing window at the angle that made the garden look like something from a story that has decided to end well. We told Jion at breakfast. I set down the tray, the egg, the toast, the orange juice at the exact temperature, a white wisteria sprig because I had found more in the north garden, and Jion looked at the tray and then at me and then at her mother, and then at the ring and then back at her mother. She signed, I knew. Shin Min-hee looked at me. I translated. She said, "When did you know?" Jion signed, the corridor. The second day, she was back. "Your scent was different." I translated this, and the expression on Shin Min-hee's face was the laugh she almost never produced, but which, when it happened, had the quality of the right kind of quiet, completely real, not managed, belonging only to the room it was in. Jion ate her egg with the satisfaction of someone whose dataset has finally caught up to her hypothesis. The bonding ceremony was small, and in the house, in the rear garden where I had first seen Shin Min-hee cross the terrace in profile, the garden where the wisteria grew in the north corner. Jion was the first witness, wearing the dark green dress from the gala, which she had instructed the household dry cleaning to maintain at permanent readiness since November. The second witness was the Friday therapist, who attended in her non-accounting capacity and gave a blessing in 2 languages, including Korean Sign Language, which she had learned 8 months ago at Jaeon's direct request, and had not mentioned to anyone until this moment. Shin Min-hee's second in command, Director Lim, a broad-shouldered beta woman who had spent 15 years determining that her principal's emotional architecture was impervious to change and had been quietly revising that assessment since April, stood at the garden gate with an expression that cycled through several things and settled on something that was trying not to show any of them. She said, to no one in particular, that in 15 years she had never once seen the CEO wait at a garden gate for anyone. She said it in the direction of the wisteria bush, and it was not addressed to me, but I heard it and filed it and was grateful for it in the way one is grateful for the things that certify what you already know. The vows were short. I had not expected the vows to be short, and I should have, because I knew how she communicated by now. Precision over volume, the thing she meant rather than the architecture around it. She said, I will use my power for you. I will remember everything you mention once. I will learn which curtain drops 2 millimeters and fix it before you notice. I will come through the front door from now on. She paused. I will be worth the attention. I said, I will tell you what I notice, not only what I observe. I will press the knock pattern on your arm every morning until you know it so completely, it's reflex. I will keep the list. I paused. I will tell you when to stop. She smiled. Not the controlled one, the real one. Jaeon signed, from the witness position with the authority of someone conducting a ceremony she has been planning since November. Now the bite. The bond snap is the thing the novels get most wrong, not in mechanics but in direction. They describe it as something done to the omega, and in the old doctrine and the inherited coldness of the alpha architecture that Shin Min-hee had been dismantling piece by piece since April. Perhaps it is. What I felt was different. What I felt was chosen, specifically, completely, the way a particular lock knows a particular key, not because it has no choice, but because it recognizes. The warmth came first. Then the color of the garden, which had been morning light and wisteria, went briefly and comprehensively more of everything it already was. Then it settled into something new and permanent, a frequency under all the other frequencies. Her. Present. Known. She was holding my face. She had not let go. Jaeon signed from 3 feet away with the tone of someone concluding a process she initiated 14 months ago by pressing a knock pattern into a maid's forearm. Done. Now we can have breakfast. The justice took 2 more months to complete its accounting, and the accounting was thorough because Shin Group's legal team was thorough, and because Jaeon had in fact left the correct note at the Singapore dinner, and the transposed figures in the 3rd column of April had led to 4 more transpositions in 3 other columns, and by January the audit was complete and the findings were public, and 2 people who had built significant careers on the confidence that the Iron Meridian was too grief managed to look carefully at her own books, discovered that she had not been managing grief. She had been managing the situation. Housekeeper Bae retired in December on terms that were considerably more generous than her laminated instruction cards had suggested she valued, and I did not mourn the laminated instruction cards. I kept the East Wing system because Jaeon's routines were Jaeon's routines, not Housekeeper Bae's. The blue rabbit cup was always the blue rabbit cup. The curtain on the left was checked every other Thursday. The knock pattern was the knock pattern. What changed was the list. The running list in the small notebook I kept in my apron pocket became a shared project, not because I showed it to anyone, but because Shin Min-hee started keeping her own, and we occasionally compared notes on the same subject from different vantage points, and the differences were interesting, And the places where we had noticed the same thing independently and written different words for it were more interesting still. 6 months after the bonding ceremony, Jaeon came to breakfast in the blue cardigan with a new item of information she had written in a text to her mother at 6:47 in the morning that she wanted to take the external performance workshop at the Seoul Center for the Deaf Arts. She showed me the text at the table. She had sent the same text to Shin Min-hee at 6:48. She signed. She already said yes. I'm telling you because you need to know the schedule. I signed, thank you for including me in the logistics. She gave me the experimental result look with the faint corner of mouth upturn. Then she signed, also because you made me good enough to audition. I said, you made yourself good enough. I provided the floor. She thought about this for a moment, the focused philosophical inquiry of a 10-year-old who takes definitions seriously. Then she signed. That's what teachers do. She ate her egg. I stood at the window spot. The wisteria in the north garden was beginning its second bloom of the year. It had surprised us all in spring, and apparently it intended to continue doing so. And the light in the east wing at 8 in the morning in this particular month of this particular year had the quality that good things have, specific, unrepeatable, belonging to itself. At 8:15 I heard the knock. Too quick. One slow. Too quick. Jaeon looked up. Shin Min-hee opened the door and came in with her coffee and sat down in the window seat beside the table, in the spot that had accumulated by now enough of her presence to be naturally hers, and looked at her daughter's breakfast and then at the wisteria sprig and then at me with the unmanaged expression, the one I had a name for now and had had a name for since the garden gate. Jaeon signed, "You're on time." "I know where the curtain is," Shin Min-hee said. Jaeon considered this and then signed, with the dignity of someone granting a significant concession. "You're improving." She went back to her egg. Her mother drank her coffee. The morning did what mornings do when the right people are present and paying attention. It simply was, without requiring anything more than that. There is a particular kind of woman the world decides early that it cannot see. The world mistakes her stillness for emptiness, her precision for coldness, her invisibility for absence. It builds systems to keep her in the gallery above the dancing floor, gives her laminated instruction cards instead of asking what she notices, offers her the grief and loyalty architecture instead of the simpler and more radical thing to be known. What changes her is not rescue, not repair, not the arrival of someone powerful enough to demand on her behalf. What changes her is the discovery that she herself has always been paying attention, and that being seen is not a gift bestowed from above, but a recognition between two people who have both decided to count. The end.